The birth of Jim Crow. The backlash against the gains of African Americans in the Reconstruction era was swift and severe. As African Americans obtained political power and began the long march toward greater social and economic equality, whites reacted with panic and outrage. Southern conservatives vowed to reverse Reconstruction and sought the abolition of the Freedmen's Bureau and all political instrumentalities designed to secure Negro supremacy. Their campaign to redeem the South was reinforced by a resurgent Ku Klux Klan, which fought a terrorist campaign against Reconstruction governments and local leaders, complete with bombings, lynchings, and mob violence. The terrorist campaign proved highly successful. Redemption resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the effective abandonment of African Americans and all those who had fought for or supported an egalitarian racial order. The federal government no longer made any effort to enforce federal civil rights legislation, and funding for the Freedmen's Bureau was slashed to such a degree that the agency became virtually defunct. Once again, vagrancy laws and other laws defining activities such as mischief and insulting gestures as crimes were enforced vigorously against blacks. The aggressive enforcement of these criminal offenses opened up an enormous market for convict leasing, in which prisoners were contracted out as laborers to the highest private bidder. Douglas Blackmon, in Slavery by Another Name, describes how tens of thousands of African Americans were arbitrarily arrested during this period, many of them hit with court costs and fines which had to be worked off in order to secure their release. With no means to pay off their debts, prisoners were sold as forced laborers to lumber camps, brickyards, railroads, farms, plantations, and dozens of corporations throughout the South. Death rates were shockingly high, for the private contractors had no interest in the health and well-being of their laborers, unlike the earlier slave owners who needed their slaves, at a minimum, to be healthy enough to survive hard labor. Laborers were subject to almost continual lashing by long horse whips, and those who collapsed due to injuries or exhaustion were often left to die. Convicts had no meaningful legal rights at this time and no effective redress. They were understood, quite literally, to be slaves of the state. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution had abolished slavery, but allowed one major exception. Slavery remained appropriate as punishment for a crime. In a landmark decision by the Virginia Supreme Court, Ruffin v. Commonwealth, issued at the height of Southern redemption, the court put to rest any notion that convicts were legally distinguishable from slaves. For a time, during his service in the penitentiary, he is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He has, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accords to him. He is for the time being a slave of the state. He is civiliter mortis, and his estate, if he has any, is administered like that of a dead man. The state of Mississippi eventually moved from hiring convict labor to organizing its own convict labor camp, known as Parchment Farm. It was not alone. During the decade following redemption, the convict population grew 10 times faster than the general population. Prisoners became younger and blacker, and the length of their sentences soared. It was the nation's first prison boom, and as they are today, the prisoners were disproportionately black. After a brief period of progress during Reconstruction, African Americans found themselves once again virtually defenseless. The criminal justice system was strategically employed to force African Americans back into a system of extreme repression and control, a tactic that will continue to prove successful for generations to come. Even as convict leasing faded away, strategic forms of exploitation and repression emerged anew. As Blackmon notes, the apparent demise of leasing prisoners seemed a harbinger of a new day. But the harsher reality of the South was that the new post-Civil War neo-slavery was evolving, not disappearing. Redemption marked a turning point in the quest by dominant whites for a new racial equilibrium, a racial order that would protect their economic, political, and social interests in a world without slavery. Yet a clear consensus among whites about what the new racial order should be was still lacking. The Redeemers who overthrew Reconstruction were inclined to retain such segregation practices as had already emerged, but they displayed no apparent disposition to expand or universalize the system. 3 alternative philosophies of race relations were put forward to compete for the region's support, all of which rejected the doctrines of extreme racism espoused by some redeemers, liberalism, conservatism, and radicalism. The liberal philosophy of race relations emphasized the stigma of segregation and the hypocrisy of a government that celebrates freedom and equality, yet denies both on account of race. This philosophy, born in the North, never gained much traction among Southern whites or blacks. The conservative philosophy, by contrast, attracted wide support and was implemented in various contexts over a considerable period of time. Conservatives blamed liberals for pushing blacks ahead of their proper station in life and placing blacks in positions they were unprepared to fill, a circumstance that had allegedly contributed to their downfall. They warned blacks that some redeemers were not satisfied with having decimated Reconstruction and were prepared to wage an aggressive war against blacks throughout the South. With some success, the conservatives reached out to African American voters, reminding them that they had something to lose as well as gain, and that the liberals' preoccupation with political and economic equality presented the danger of losing all that blacks had so far gained. The radical philosophy offered, for many African Americans, the most promise. It was predicated on a searing critique of large corporations, particularly railroads and the wealthy elite in the North and South. The radicals of the late 19th century, who later formed the Populist Party, viewed the privileged classes as conspiring to keep poor whites and blacks locked into a subordinate political and economic position. For many African American voters, the populist approach was preferable to the paternalism of liberals. Populists preached an equalitarianism of want and poverty, the kinship of a common grievance and a common oppressor, as described by Tom Watson, a prominent populist leader, in a speech advocating a union between black and white farmers. You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism that enslaves you both. You are deceived and blinded that you may not see how this race antagonism perpetuates a monetary system which beggars both. In an effort to demonstrate their commitment to a genuinely multiracial working class movement against white elites, the populists made strides toward racial integration, a symbol of their commitment to class-based unity. African Americans throughout the South responded with great hope and enthusiasm, eager to be true partners in a struggle for social justice. According to Woodward, it is altogether probable that during the brief populist upheaval in the 90s, Negroes and Native whites achieved a greater comedy of mind and harmony of political purpose than ever before or since in the South. The challenges inherent in creating the alliance sought by the populists were formidable, as race prejudice ran the highest among the very white populations to which the populist appeal was specifically addressed, the depressed lower economic classes. Nevertheless, the populist movement initially enjoyed remarkable success in the South, fueled by a wave of discontent aroused by the severe agrarian depression of the 1880s and 1890s. The populists took direct aim at the conservatives, who were known as comprising a party of privilege, and they achieved a stunning series of political victories throughout the region. Alarmed by the success of the populists and the apparent potency of the alliance between poor and working class whites and African Americans, the conservatives raised the cry of white supremacy and resorted to the tactics they had employed in their quest for redemption, including fraud, intimidation, bribery, and terror. Segregation laws were proposed as part of a deliberate effort to drive a wedge between poor whites and African Americans. These discriminatory barriers were designed to encourage lower-class whites to retain a sense of superiority over blacks, making it far less likely that they would sustain interracial political alliance. The laws were, in effect, another racial bribe. As William Julius Wilson has noted, as long as poor whites directed their hatred and frustration against the black competitor, the planters were relieved of class hostility directed against them. Indeed, in order to overcome the well-founded suspicions of poor and illiterate whites that they, as well as blacks, were in danger of losing the right to vote, the leaders of the movement pursued an aggressive campaign of white supremacy in every state prior to black disenfranchisement. Ultimately, the populists caved to the pressure and abandoned their former allies. While the populist movement was at the peak of zeal, Woodward observed, The two races had surprised each other and astonished their opponents by the harmony they achieved and the goodwill with which they cooperated. But when it became clear that the conservatives would stop at nothing to decimate their alliance, the biracial partnership dissolved and populist leaders realigned themselves with conservatives. Even Tom Watson, who had been among the most forceful advocates for an interracial alliance of farmers, concluded that populist principles could never be fully embraced by the South until blacks were eliminated from politics. The agricultural depression, taken together with a series of failed reforms and broken political promises, had pyramided to a climax of social tensions. Dominant whites concluded that it was in their political and economic interests to scapegoat blacks, and permission to hate came from sources that had formerly denied it, including Northern liberals eager to reconcile with the South, Southern conservatives who had once promised blacks protection from racial extremism, and populists who cast aside their dark-skinned allies when the partnership fell under siege. History seemed to repeat itself. Just as the white elite had successfully driven a wedge between poor whites and blacks following Bacon's rebellion by creating the institution of black slavery, another racial caste system was emerging nearly 2 centuries later, in part due to efforts by white elites to decimate a multiracial alliance of poor people. By the turn of the 20th century, every state in the South had laws on the books that disenfranchised blacks and discriminated against them in virtually every sphere of life, lending sanction to a racial ostracism that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels, restaurants, hospitals, orphanages, prisons, funeral homes, morgues, and cemeteries. Politicians competed with each other by proposing and passing ever more stringent, oppressive, and downright ridiculous legislation, such as laws specifically prohibiting blacks and whites from playing chess together. The public symbols and constant reminders of black subjugation were supported by whites across the political spectrum, though the plight of poor whites remained largely unchanged. For them, the racial bribe was primarily psychological. The new racial order, known as Jim Crow, a term apparently derived from a minstrel show character, was regarded as the final settlement, the return to sanity, and the permanent system. Of course, the earlier system of racialized social control slavery had also been regarded as final, sane, and permanent by its supporters. Like the earlier system, Jim Crow seemed natural, and it became difficult to remember that alternative paths were not only available at one time, but nearly embraced.